The Hartwell family had gathered for what they thought would be a routine reading of their mother's will. Instead, they discovered that Eleanor had left her entire $12 million estate to Bentley, her golden retriever. As the siblings erupted in fury and accusations flew across the courtroom, no one noticed that Bentley was watching someone very carefully, someone who shouldn't have been there. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of courtroom 12 in downtown Manhattan, its golden rays illuminating dust motes that danced in the heavy air of anticipation. The Hartwell family inheritance hearing had drawn quite a crowd, not just family members, but curious onlookers, local reporters, and legal professionals who had heard whispers about the unusual nature of Eleanor Hartwell's final will and testament. Eleanor Hartwell had been one of New York's most prominent philanthropists, a woman whose charitable work and business acumen had earned her both respect and envy throughout the city's elite circles. Her textile empire, built from nothing over 40 years, had made her one of the wealthiest women in the state. But Eleanor had also been known for her eccentricities, her fierce independence, and most notably, her absolute devotion to Bentley, a golden retriever she had rescued from a shelter 3 years earlier. Now, as family members filed into the courtrooms, polished wooden pews, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Richard Hartwell, Eleanor's eldest son, adjusted his expensive Italian suit and checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. At 47, Richard had spent his entire adult life assuming he would inherit the family fortune, using that expectation to secure loans for his struggling investment firm. His wife, Patricia, sat beside him with perfectly manicured nails drumming impatiently against her designer handbag, her lips pressed into a thin line of barely concealed resentment. Across the aisle sat Margaret Hartwell Chune, Eleanor's daughter, whose relationship with her mother had been complicated by years of disagreement over Margaret's choice to pursue social work instead of joining the family business. At 43, Margaret had spent 2 decades trying to prove her worth too. A mother who seemed to value financial success above all else. Her husband, David, squeezed her hand reassuringly, but both could feel the weight of their mounting medical bills from their son's ongoing treatment for leukemia. The youngest Hartwell sibling, Thomas, sat alone in the back row, his rumpled clothes and bloodshot eyes telling the story of another long night at the casino. At 39, Tommy had burned through every opportunity his mother had given him, squandering investments and accumulating debts that had tested even Eleanor's patience. He clutched a betting slip from last night's horse races, his hands trembling, slightly whether from anxiety or withdrawal. Only he knew. But the most important attendees sat calmly in a special area near the front of the courtroom, completely unaware of the magnitude of attention focused on him. Bentley, a magnificent golden retriever with a coat that gleamed like spun gold, lay peacefully on a custom cushion provided by the court. His gentle brown eyes surveyed the room with the calm wisdom that had made him Eleanor's constant companion during her final years. A red silk bow tied around his neck, Eleanor's touch gave him an air of dignified formality that seemed almost human. Judge Catherine Morrison entered the courtroom with the measured steps of someone who had presided over countless family disputes. But even her experienced demeanor showed hints of curiosity about this particular case. At 62, Judge Morrison had seen family greed tear apart relationships worth far more than money. But a $12 million inheritance left to a dog was unprecedented even for her court. "This hearing will come to order," Judge Morrison announced, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We are here to address the probate of Eleanor Hartwell's last will and testament, dated March 15th of this year, and to hear challenges to its validity." Attorney James Wellington rose from his position at the petitioner's table, his silver hair and charcoal suit projecting the gravitas that had made him one of the city's most respected estate lawyers. Wellington had been Eleanor's legal counsel for over 20 years, and his expression suggested he was prepared for the battle that was about to unfold. "Your Honor," Wellington began, his voice measured and clear, "I had the privilege of representing Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell for the final 2 decades of her remarkable life. The will I am presenting today was drafted with her full knowledge and consent, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and reflects her clear and considered final wishes. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Wellington opened the leather portfolio containing Eleanor's will. The document had already been reviewed in private, but hearing it read aloud in the formal setting of the courtroom would make its shocking contents undeniably real. I, Eleanor Margaret Hartwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all financial assets, real property, investments, and personal effects, to my beloved companion Bentley, a golden retriever, to be held in trust and administered by the Hartwell Foundation for his care and comfort for the remainder of his natural life. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Even though the family had been informed of the will's contents during the private reading, hearing it announced in open court triggered an eruption of emotion that Judge Morrison had to gavel into submission. "This is insane!" Richard Hartwell shouted, jumping to his feet despite his attorney's restraining hand on his arm. My mother was clearly suffering from dementia. No rational person leaves $12 million to a dog. "Sit down, Mr. Hartwell," Judge Morrison commanded sharply. "You will have your opportunity to present your case through proper legal channels." Margaret Hartwell Chun dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her voice breaking as she spoke to anyone. Who would listen? She knew about Jason's medical bills. She knew we were struggling. How could she ignore her own grandson's needs for a pet? Thomas Hartwell said nothing, but his hands clenched into fists as he stared at Bentley with undisguised resentment. The dog's calm presence seemed to mock Tommy's desperation, his mounting debts, and his complete dependence on what he had believed would be his salvation. Throughout the emotional outburst, Bentley remained remarkably composed, his head moving slowly as he observed each family member in turn. His intelligent eyes seemed to be processing the anger and pain around him, but his expression remained gentle and non-judgmental, exactly the temperament that endeared him to Eleanor during her lonely final years. Dr. Patricia Adams, a neurologist who had examined Eleanor just 6 months before her death, was called as the first witness. Her testimony was crucial to establishing Eleanor's mental competency at the time the will was drafted. Mrs. Hartwell was remarkably sharp for someone her age, Dr. Adams testified under oath. Her cognitive tests showed no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other condition that would have impaired her judgment. She was fully capable of making informed decisions about her estate. The Hartwell family's attorney, Marcus Reed, attempted to challenge this assessment during cross-examination. Reed was younger than Wellington, hungrier, and determined to prove that Eleanor's devotion to Bentley was evidence of diminished capacity rather than genuine affection. "Doctor, isn't it true that excessive attachment to pets can be a sign of social isolation and declining mental health in elderly patients?" Reed pressed. "Objection," Wellington interjected smoothly. "The question assumes facts not in evidence and asks for speculation outside the witness's expertise." "Sustained," Judge Morrison ruled, but the damage was done. Reed had planted the seed of doubt about Eleanor's mental state during her final months. As the morning progressed, witness after witness painted a picture of Eleanor's final years that was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Maria Santos, Eleanor's housekeeper for 15 years, testified about the transformation she had witnessed after Bentley's arrival. "Mrs. Hartwell was so lonely before Bentley came," Maria said, her accented English heavy with emotion. "Her children, they visit maybe once a month, always asking for money. But Bentley, he stay with her every day. When she gets sick, he never leave her side. He make her happy again." The testimony revealed a pattern that cast the Hartwell children's objections in an uncomfortable light. Phone records showed that Richard had called his mother primarily when his business was struggling. Margaret's visits had clustered around her son's medical crises and the associated financial stress. Thomas's contact with Eleanor had been sporadic at best, usually coinciding with his gambling losses and desperate need for funds. But it was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Eleanor's personal physician, whose testimony provided the most damning insight into the family dynamics. Dr. Warren had made house calls to Eleanor during her final illness, and her medical notes painted a picture of a woman who found more comfort in her dog's presence than in her children's occasional visits. Mrs. Hartwell explicitly told me that Bentley was the only family member who loved her unconditionally, Dr. Warren testified. She said her children saw her as a bank account with legs, but Bentley saw her as simply Eleanor. That distinction was very important to her. During the lunch recess, the Hartwell siblings huddled with their attorney in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse. The morning had not gone well for their case, and Reed was scrambling to find new angles of attack. "We need to focus on the practical impossibility of the arrangement," Reed advised. No matter how much she loved that dog, leaving $12 million to an animal is inherently irrational. Dogs don't need luxury cars or yacht clubs. But Richard wasn't listening to legal strategy. His face was red with frustration and mounting panic as he thought about the debts that would crush him without his expected inheritance. "There has to be someone behind this. Dogs don't write wills." Someone convinced her to do this. Margaret shook her head sadly. "Richard, maybe we need to accept that Mother made her choice. We weren't there for her when she needed us." "Don't. Give me that guilt trip," Richard snapped. "I had a business to run. You had your own family to worry about. We can't be expected to babysit a lonely old woman." Thomas, who had been silent throughout the lunch break, finally spoke up. "Maybe she was trying to teach us something. Maybe the will isn't really about the money." His siblings stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. For Richard and Margaret, the money represented survival. Richard's business was failing, and Margaret's medical bills were overwhelming. The idea that Eleanor might have had motives beyond financial distribution seemed incomprehensible. When court reconvened, Wellington called his final witness, Dr. Michael Harrison, an animal behaviorist who had worked with Eleanor and Bentley. During the dog's training as a therapy animal, Dr. Harrison's testimony would prove to be the turning point in the entire case. Mrs. Hartwell brought Bentley to me because she wanted to train him for therapy work at the Children's Hospital, Dr. Harrison explained. She had observed his natural empathy and wanted to channel it toward helping sick children. Bentley was exceptionally gifted in reading human emotions and responding appropriately. As Dr. Harrison spoke, Bentley's behavior began to change. The dog, who had been calmly observing the proceedings all morning, suddenly became alert. His ears perked forward, and his nose began working as if he had detected something significant. In fact, Dr. Harrison continued, Bentley demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was in emotional distress or physical danger. Mrs. Hartwell often said he had saved her life on several occasions by alerting her to health emergencies before she was aware of them herself. Bentley stood up from his cushion, his tail wagging slowly as his attention focused on someone in the gallery. His movement caught Judge Morrison's attention, but she allowed the testimony to continue. The bond between Mrs. Hartwell and Bentley was unlike anything I had seen in 30 years of working with therapy animals, Dr. Harrison testified. It wasn't just affection, it was a deep, intuitive connection that seemed to transcend normal human-animal relationships. Suddenly, Bentley began moving through the courtroom with purposeful determination. His behavior was calm but insistent, exactly the kind of focused attention that Dr. Harrison had just described. The dog walked past the Hartwell family without pause, past the legal teams, and directly toward a man sitting alone in the back corner of the gallery. The man was unremarkable in appearance, perhaps 60 years old, wearing a simple gray suit and thick glasses. He had introduced himself to court security as a journalism student researching inheritance law. But Bentley's reaction suggested something far more significant. As Bentley approached, the man's composure cracked visibly. His face went pale, and his hands began to tremble as the golden retriever sat directly in front of him and began the soft whining behavior that therapy dogs used to provide comfort to distressed individuals. "What's happening?" Judge Morrison asked, her attention now fully focused on the unusual interaction taking place in her courtroom. The man tried to stand and leave, but Bentley's gentle but insistent presence seemed to root him in place. The dog's behavior was unmistakably that of a therapy animal who had detected someone in severe emotional distress. "Sir," Judge Morrison called out, "please identify yourself to the court." The man's voice shook as he replied, I'm Dr. Robert Chun. I was Mrs. Hartwell's personal physician 20 years ago." A gasp went through the courtroom. Margaret Hartwell Chun's face went white as she stared at the man who shared her married name. David Chun, Margaret's husband, half rose from his seat, his expression a mixture of confusion and recognition. "Dr. Chun," Wellington said slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You were struck off the medical register for insurance fraud, weren't you?" Dr. Chun nodded miserably, his composure completely shattered under Bentley's unwavering. "Attention. 20 years ago, I falsified medical records to help wealthy patients claim insurance payouts they weren't entitled to. Mrs. Hartwell was one of my patients at the time." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Margaret stared at the man in horror as the implications became clear. Dr. Robert Chun was David's father, the father David had claimed was dead, the father whose disgrace had forced David to change his name and rebuild his life from nothing. "Mrs. Hartwell discovered what I was doing," Dr. Chun continued, his voice barely audible. "She could have destroyed me completely, sent me to prison. Instead, she gave me a choice: disappear from my family's life forever and never contact them again or face full prosecution." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face as she understood the full scope of her mother's sacrifice. Eleanor had known about David's father all along, had protected the man her daughter loved by ensuring his father's disgrace couldn't touch them, but had demanded a price that had torn David's family apart. "I took the deal," Dr. Chun whispered. "I let my son believe I was dead rather than face him with the truth of what I had become. Mrs. Hartwell kept my secret all these years, even when it meant watching her daughter struggle financially, rather than reveal that she had the power to." "Help." Wellington stood slowly, the final pieces of Eleanor's complex legacy falling into place. "Dr. Chun, did Mrs. Hartwell ever indicate why she might have structured her will the way she did?" "She said Bentley was the only family member who loved her without wanting anything in return," Dr. Chun replied. "But she also said that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to prove their love isn't conditional on money." The courtroom was silent except for the gentle sound of Bentley's contented breathing as he remained close to Dr. Chun, providing the comfort that came naturally to him. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying the scene before her with the wisdom of someone who had seen human nature in all its complexity. "Mr. Wellington," she said finally, "am I to understand that Mrs. Hartwell's will was designed to test her family's love for her?" "I believe so, Your Honor. Mrs. Hartwell was a brilliant woman who understood that money often corrupts relationships. By removing the financial incentive, she created an opportunity for her children to demonstrate whether their love for her was genuine." Margaret stood up slowly, her voice thick with emotion as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I would like to withdraw our challenge to the will." Richard spun around to stare at his sister in shock. "Margaret, are you insane? We're talking about $12 million. "No, Richard," Margaret replied quietly, her gaze fixed on Bentley, who had returned to his place near the judge's bench. "We're talking about Mother's final lesson. She wanted to know if we loved her for herself or for her money. Look at how we've behaved today. Look at the anger and greed we've shown. And then look at Bentley." The golden retriever sat calmly, his gentle presence a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had surrounded him all day. He had not reacted to the shouting, the accusations, or the legal maneuvering. Instead, he had done exactly what he had been trained to do: provide comfort to someone in need, regardless of personal gain. Thomas stood up next, his voice hoarse with shame. "She's right. I haven't called Mother in 6 months, except when I needed money. The last time I saw her, I asked for $20,000 before I even asked how she was feeling. Richard remained seated, his face a mask of stubborn refusal to accept what his siblings were saying. This is ridiculous. You're both being manipulated by a dead woman's guilt trip. That dog doesn't need $12 million. You're right, Wellington said quietly. Bentley doesn't need $12 million, but maybe that's exactly the point. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess to allow the family time to confer. During the break, Margaret approached Dr. Chun, who had remained in his seat, still visibly shaken by Bentley's recognition. I'm Margaret, she said softly. I married your son. Dr. Chun looked up at her with eyes full of pain and regret. David is a good man, better than his father ever was. I hope I didn't ruin things for him by coming here today. He thinks you're dead, Margaret said gently. 20 years of thinking his father abandoned him. 20 years of wondering what he did wrong. I did abandon him, Dr. Chun replied. Bitterly, I chose the easy way out instead of facing the consequences of my actions. Margaret sat down beside him, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. Mother gave you a second chance 20 years ago. Maybe it's time to take it. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had completely changed. Margaret stood to address Judge Morrison, her voice clear and determined. Your Honor, my family has had time to discuss the situation, and we've reached a unanimous decision. We are withdrawing all challenges to our mother's will. Bentley should inherit exactly what she intended him to have. Richard started to object, but Margaret continued speaking. However, we would like to petition the court to allow us to serve as volunteer caretakers for Bentley without any financial compensation. We believe that's what our mother really wanted, for us to learn to love her family the way she did, unconditionally. Judge Morrison smiled for the first time since the hearing began. That seems like a very reasonable arrangement. Mr. Wellington, are there provisions in the trust for such an arrangement? Wellington nodded, consulting his documents. Mrs. Hartwell was remarkably thorough in her planning. The trust documents specifically allow for family members to serve as caretakers if they can demonstrate genuine commitment to Bentley's welfare over a 6-month probationary period. Then it's settled, Judge Morrison announced. The will stands as written. Bentley inherits the full estate, to be administered by the Hartwell Foundation Trust. The petitioner's challenges are dismissed, and the family is granted permission to apply for caretaker status through the proper channels. As the court proceedings concluded, Bentley walked over to each of the Hartwell siblings in turn, his tail wagging gently as he seemed to offer them the same unconditional acceptance he had given their mother. Richard, still bitter but beginning to understand, knelt down to pet the dog for the first time in years. I guess you're the boss now, he said quietly to Bentley, his voice thick with emotions he wasn't ready to name. The golden retriever responded with a gentle lick to Richard's hand, a gesture of forgiveness that their mother would have recognized and appreciated. Margaret walked over to Dr. Chun, who was preparing to leave the courtroom alone. There's someone I'd like you to meet, she said gently. Someone who has spent 20 years wondering what happened to his father. As the Hartwell family left the courthouse together for the first time in years, Bentley walked proudly among them, his presence a living reminder of Eleanor's final gift, the chance to rebuild their relationships on a foundation of love rather than greed. 3 months later, Margaret submitted the family's first report to the trust administrators. The document detailed Bentley's daily routine, his veterinary care, and his continued work as a therapy dog at the Children's Hospital. Legacy Eleanor had started, but never had the chance to complete. But more importantly, the report included notes about family dinners that now happen weekly, about Richard's tentative steps toward rebuilding his business on honest foundations, and about Thomas's enrollment in a treatment program for gambling addiction. Dr. Chun had been reunited with his son, and while the healing would take time, the family was finally complete. Eleanor Hartwell had been buried 6 months earlier in a small ceremony attended only by her immediate family and Bentley. But her true memorial was not a headstone or a building bearing her name. It was the sound of laughter at family gatherings. The sight of her children learning to care for each other the way they now care for Bentley, and the knowledge that love, not money, was the only inheritance that truly mattered. As Bentley settled into his favorite spot by the fireplace in Margaret's living room, surrounded by the family that had finally learned to love without condition, he rested his golden head on his paws with the contentment of a job well done. Eleanor's plan had worked perfectly, and in the end, everyone had inherited exactly what they needed most. This story reminds us that the greatest inheritances aren't measured in dollars, but in the love and wisdom that outlive us. Eleanor's final gift to her family wasn't money. It was the chance to discover that their bond was worth far more than any fortune. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. In Bentley's gentle presence, the Hartwell family found not just a beloved pet, but a mirror that reflected their capacity for unconditional love. What other incredible stories of family, loyalty, and life-changing revelations are waiting to you? Be discovered? Subscribe for more emotional tailies that will remind you of what truly matters in life.